Hello everybody. Today I'll be talking about Valkyria Chronicles. If you haven't played Valkyria Chronicles, you may have a hard time following this video. For the benefit of newcomers, I'll provide some basic background information on the gameplay systems as I go along, although you should note that there will be plot spoilers for the whole game in this video. Valkyria Chronicles was released by Sega in 2008 for the PlayStation 3. It was ported to PC in 2014, and that's the platform this review is based on. While there are a number of minor differences between the original version and PC port, the most significant is the decrease in loading times. Several players have noted that game saving is so fast that they were initially unsure if it had gone through. That said, there are clear signs that this title is a port from the PS3, namely through its emphasis on using the D-pad for aiming. Players aren't blocked from using the left analog stick, but the reticule sensitivity is highly awkward. This makes me think that the game was designed with the PlayStation controller in mind, which of course it was, because it was a PS3 exclusive. I'm always fascinated by the way the subtle differences between the Xbox and PlayStation controllers contribute to gameplay design. The Xbox D-pad is weak, but its analog sticks are positioned for comfortable simultaneous movement, enabling easy running and gunning in first-person shooters. This is difficult to do with the DualShock 3, but its D-pad is in a much more convenient location. I can always tell that a game was designed for the Xbox first when it's twitchy and heavily reliant on simultaneous camera and player movement, whereas games that emphasize the D-pad were almost always designed for the PlayStation first. Valkyria takes place during a fictionalized version of early World War II on the continent of Europa. Europa is split between the Federation, which roughly resembles the Allies, and the Empire, which roughly resembles the Axis powers. The game takes place in Gallia, a nominally neutral country whose mountainous, green terrain and militia culture are reminiscent of Switzerland. While a great deal of care has been taken to draw clear parallels with the Second World War, Valkyria is squarely in the realm of historical fiction. As the player progresses through the game, the plot is largely driven by cutscenes. These cutscenes are complemented by item descriptions, newspaper snippets, and glossary items that add a great deal of depth. I think it's a disservice to call Valkyria a tactical RPG, because this leaves out its excellent and fully fleshed out narrative. The initial, simplistic good versus evil plotline evolves into a much more complex and nuanced story that contemplates the role of power in the world. The game starts this off by emphasizing the power of teamwork versus individual heroics when it begins introducing the core gameplay mechanics. The first mission has the player control 3 units to defeat an enemy commander and introduces many of the game's basic concepts. Valkyria uses an active turn-based battle system, dubbed Blitz, or Battle of Live Tactical Zones. Players spend command points to take control of a unit and move them around the battlefield. Selecting a unit allows the player to take a single action, such as shooting at an enemy or healing. What's unique about this system is that when a unit is active, enemy units that can see it can automatically fire at it. In contrast, with most other turn-based games, Valkyria doesn't allow the player to dawdle in the middle of the battlefield when it's their turn. This adds a sense of urgency to the player's moves that greatly speeds up the gameplay. More significantly, it adds a number of elements that change the way players typically think about positioning in turn-based RPGs. The most important of these is unit specialization. Players control a squad comprised of 5 classes and a tank, getting 2 tanks by the end of the game. Different classes are good at different things. Scouts have the best vision and range, but low defense. Shock troopers have high attack and defense, but limited range. Lancers are good at fighting tanks, but weak against most everything else. Snipers are fragile but extremely powerful, and engineers provide a number of support capabilities. This brings into play the counter system. One of the most challenging design decisions in games with multiple class types on the field is how hard to make counters. The notion of hard versus soft counters originally comes from real-time strategy, and it is best understood through the lens of rock, paper, scissors. In rock, paper, scissors, rock always beats scissors, scissors always beats paper, and paper always beats rock. This is a hard counter system. In a soft counter system, rock would usually beat scissors, but it's not guaranteed. Finding the sweet spot between these two extremes is difficult. Hard counter systems reward skilled players that are able to pick exactly the units they need, position them correctly, and adjust as needed. Soft counter systems are more forgiving to newer players, but also add much needed complexity and unpredictability to a game. There's more to it than that, but that's the gist. Rock always beating scissors isn't very interesting. Valkyria leans heavily toward hard counters, complementing its strong narrative emphasis on teamwork. A single shock trooper can devastate a group of poorly positioned weaker units. This forces players to carefully consider their class blend and positioning as they move up the field. Luck plays a minimal role. The correct action is rewarded, and the incorrect action punished. The use of potentials, special, unique status effects that apply to different units, amplifies this by enabling devastating unit combinations and squad member placements. Potentials also add a much welcomed fuzziness and unpredictability to the combat, particularly for players who don't carefully follow the potentials of their squad members. Potentials are one of many ways that Valkyria adds significant depth to its character progression. Many potentials rely on squad members liking other squad members, or whether the unit is in a particular environment. The complexity is vast enough that even with only 60 or so total squad members to choose from, a veteran player would still be discovering new, interesting combinations long after their first playthrough. The equipment upgrade system, in contrast, leaves much to be desired. By the time the player unlocks skill trees and begins to lack the requisite money to get every single upgrade, they are already receiving custom, extremely powerful weapons from Princess Cordelia. Combine this with the tendency of players to reuse the same squad members in most operations, and by the end of the game, the equipment screen really doesn't matter. The problem, for me at least, was that the weapons given by Cordelia were so much better in most respects than the other guns, that even if they were slightly worse in one area than the weapon obtained from the focused upgrade path, they were still a clear, better overall choice. Along the theme of working as a team, levels are obtained by class rather than on individual units. Probably my biggest complaint about the leveling system is that, aside from the class upgrades that unlock new abilities, it's not obvious how it impacts your fighting capabilities. There's no numerical representation of the value of going from, say, level 6 to level 7. This is largely a minor point, because of the hard counter system that heavily rewards proper unit selection and positioning over the strengths of the individual units themselves. One clear exception to this is the leader unit system. The player has a set of fixed leader units that are unable to die, whereas the computer receives an assortment of different leaders depending on the mission. Each leader unit on the field grants an extra turn. This means it's advantageous to deploy all of your leader units all of the time, even if you don't plan on using them. In principle, the idea of certain units conferring benefits due to their leadership abilities seems like a good idea. In practice, it contradicts the theme of teamwork because it often results in your squad's leaders idling at base camp, passively accumulating command points on your behalf. I think it would have made more sense to tie leadership benefits into another system. The potential system, for instance, already includes logic for synergistic unit combinations. Alternatively, leader-specific abilities could have been added, such as higher action points or the ability to revive on-field rather than calling in a medic. Granted, none of these are particularly good ideas either, but as implemented, leadership benefits have little to do with on-the-field leadership, which doesn't make much sense. I'm sure the designers could come up with something better, and it's a credit to Valkyria's cohesive design that something so small sticks out so significantly. I'll also mention for newcomers to the game that the Edelweiss tank unit has a pretty unique upgrade system of arranging upgrades into a 4x3 block. I don't have much to say on this one, but I wanted to mention it as it was a pretty neat interface. Much of these details are boiled down during gameplay into the map screen, which helpfully provides equipment and potential information in real time. What's probably most unique about this screen compared to most other RPGs is the information it doesn't offer, namely detailed environment layouts, enemy positions, and terrain information. The map is a rough sketch of what the battlefield looks like, which contrasts with many other turn-based RPGs that have a tendency to provide a detailed, bird's-eye view of the terrain. Players won't know exactly what they're looking at until they've already selected their units and began their turn, which is essentially the same situation a real field commander in World War II would find themselves in. This is a great touch that helps build an immersive atmosphere. Gameplay, then, is a continuous transition between active mode, selecting a unit, moving it around, seeing the environment for what it is, and taking actions, and map mode, hence why commentators often refer to Valkyria as a semi-active turn-based RPG. This has a nice pacing to it, particularly because positioning is much more important in Valkyria than in other turn-based RPGs. Other games often place battles in the middle of a wide open area, teleporting your entire party into the fight in the process. Valkyria's map, as inexact as it may be, is a more accurate representation of your progress on the field than you typically find in these sorts of games. It contrasts sharply with the clarity of active mode, which helps a player develop an affinity for the game's characters and again contributes to player immersion. One interesting aspect of Valkyria's map design is its limited use of fog of war. The map predefines all of the enemy's camps, and a sniper in a sniper's nest can quickly identify virtually every enemy on the field. This presents a problem because in almost every operation, the computer has a significant advantage in number of camps, soldiers, and tanks. Valkyria solves this potential unfairness by significantly limiting the computer's ability to make proactive decisions. AI design is challenging because computers, especially in a tactical RPG, can quickly figure out the most optimal decision to make. In particular, the failure state of the Edelweiss getting destroyed and the large number of turns the computer receives means that the computer could win most operations just by swarming the player. To fix this, the AI in Valkyria rarely makes the best proactive choice, meaning that it doesn't proactively try to win the fight. Instead, it largely reacts to player decisions and capitalizes on player mistakes. Now, I'm speculating here because I've never looked at the AI code for this game, but the lack of a fog of war tells me that the computer is fully capable of making the best proactive decisions. The fact that it never does tells me that it was programmed not to, or rather, it was never programmed to do so in the first place. This grants a huge amount of fairness to the combat because any losses the player incurs can directly be tied back to a mistake that the player made rather than an optimal proactive choice on the part of the computer. Valkyria capitalizes on this design through its deep combat system, where making a mistake can often mean not doing the right thing rather than actively doing the wrong thing. By this I mean, it's not always obvious that the player has made a mistake. The best example for me is the second to last mission, where the player is pinned down by 2 anti-tank turrets and 3 Gatling guns. A player who has failed to realize up to that point that Gatling guns can be killed in one turn by throwing a grenade behind them will struggle immensely with this operation. It's not to say that Valkyria holds out on you. Many of the game's core mechanics are spelled out explicitly during the early game. These explanations are short and concise, and the designers made the very smart decision not to accompany them with voice dialogue. This would have prompted many players to sit and listen to each blurb one by one, which would have negatively affected the pacing. Beyond these core systems, however, it's left up to the player to discover everything else, and even the core systems aren't explained in full. The orders system, accessible in map mode, provides generic descriptions of what different orders do, but fails to provide any sort of numerical values. This encourages players to experiment with different orders and see what effect they have, prompting the player to experiment with other systems as well. The game's decision to leave things intentionally fuzzy, however, falls flat for me in unit potentials. Many unit potentials are not clearly explained, and even when I tried to use them, I found that I didn't quite understand how they worked. Due to the way the enemy AI capitalizes heavily on player mistakes, it can feel very costly and burdensome to experiment. Likely to counteract this, the game offers a skirmish mode, which is a more standard tactical RPG experience. Skirmishes are essentially replays of earlier operations, allowing players to try new things and see if they work. Valkyria even directly tells the player that skirmishes can be used to grind experience and currency, implying that if a player is having difficulty, they should go back, play a skirmish, and learn more about the game. I was extremely disheartened when I first saw this explanation, and pleasantly surprised that I was able to successfully finish the game without ever needing to grind, so I wonder if that text blurb should be reworded. One of the advantages of all this depth is that it adds a great deal of replayability to the game. Much of Valkyria's charm stems from the fact that no operation feels like a standard move forward, fight, and win. There is always some unique hook that makes each operation feel different. Having a deep combat system enables players to come back to the game and continue to enjoy it, learn new things, and get better, even if they already know about the surprises the game has in store for them. The uniqueness of each mission ensures that Valkyria never feels tired, because no operation plays exactly the same as the previous one. Valkyria continuously adds new game mechanics and stage hazards as the game moves forward. Some of these work better than others, and I'd be lying if I told you that I didn't think some of the operations were poorly designed or overly contrived. Redirecting the Marmotte, while unique, was perhaps the most boring mission in the game. The final boss encounter leveraged a unique power-up mechanic that felt similarly cheesy and poorly thought out. That all said, I don't think the designers made a mistake by experimenting and taking risks. My favorite mission, storming the beachhead with smoke grenades, is the type of mission that most turn-based RPGs would try once and probably screw up, but Valkyria includes several missions that are equally unique, all of them done pretty well. One minor quibble I have is that some of the missions feel overly long, and sometimes newly introduced mechanics can feel gimmicky. The beachhead assault mission took so long that I ended up losing one of my squad members simply out of impatience of wanting to finish it. The destruction of the Marmotte so severely punished tanks that stood in front of the dreadnought that I ended up spending about 10 minutes mindlessly shooting rockets at the Valkov with one of my lancers, which left me feeling pretty unsatisfied. Fortunately, the game paces itself very well, intermixing operations, cutscenes, and other minor events such as new newspaper stories and decorations. The story of the game is told by the narrator, Irene Kohler, who the player later finds out is the embedded reporter in the squad, and progress is represented using a book that tells the history of the Gallian War. The gameplay shares this aesthetic, adding a storybook-like white border around squad members as they move around the environment. It's a unique presentation that is incredibly well executed, helped along by the effectively non-existent loading times on the PC platform. Cutscenes are a mix between dialogue that the player presses through and more standard movie-like cutscenes. Each little piece of narrative, from the minor, optional cutscenes to newspaper articles on events in Gallia to the glossary, helps build an immersive, cohesive game world. Valkyria is a story of war told through the lens of its participants, which is what the cutscenes focus on. The complementary information, however, is just as important, at least to me. It adds much needed color and depth. I particularly liked the weapon descriptions, which take pains to be historically accurate. All this is to say that the little touches don't mean much by themselves, but when you add them all together, they are essential to the strength of the narrative by contextualizing it. The best example I can think of to demonstrate this is the death of Isara. I'm not one to typically grow attached to characters in computer games, largely because they're often one-dimensional and unbelievable caricatures. All of the little details in the game about Isara's hopes and dreams, her background, the discrimination that Darksons faced in modern society, her relationships with other characters, added up to a surprisingly impactful death sequence. Isara's funeral is perhaps the best cutscene in the game, and I felt a strong feeling of loss knowing that this person would never grow up to do all the things in life that she wanted to do. One of the great sins in narrative design for me is the way that game designers manipulate players' emotions by purposefully pushing their buttons and creating unnecessarily contrived and convoluted situations. Valkyria doesn't do this. It patiently builds the narrative and helps the player identify with the characters through its gameplay systems. The sadness that players feel after Isara's death doesn't require any tricks from the game designer. It feels real, and the impact on the player is exactly as strong as it needs to be. Games shouldn't need to trick the player into caring about the game, its world, or its characters. If affinity with the characters is a goal of the game, then the game's systems should simply be designed with this in mind. Ryutaro Nonaka, one of the game's producers, explains this best. The first time that we made this game, it was actually a regular tactical RPG. We didn't have a grid from the start, but it was a top-down map, and we worked on that. But then, after we played that initial build, we realized that it didn't express what we wanted to communicate in the game, which was having the player identify with the characters in the game. The strength of the cutscenes is complemented by the game's fantastic art design, a somewhat more realistic version of cel shading. Characters are able to convey a wide variety of believable emotions. Of particular note is Alicia's reaction to discovering that she is a Valkyria. The scene and the voice acting clearly convey the sense of someone who is feeling lost and unsure of her place in the world. It helps that the cutscenes share the same art design as the gameplay itself, and often take place on the battlefield where your squad was just fighting. This ensures that each operation and cutscene feels like a part of a larger journey rather than something standalone, and drives home the affinity that the player feels with the game's characters. Valkyria's biggest strength, to me, comes from its complex and multi-dimensional characters, all of whom feel believable and real. Characters are well designed and thought through, with potentials and voice dialogues that reflect their backgrounds. The relationship between Isara and Rosie is one of the highlights, and over the course of the game, the relationship evolves and changes much as you would expect it to. What's great about this is that the characters are consistent. Rosie has a deep-seated prejudice against Darksons, and this is a character trait that is touched on over and over again over the course of the game. You wouldn't expect Rosie to change overnight just because she met a nice Darkson, and she doesn't. This is one of the subtle touches that most narratives misunderstand. People have long-standing sets of experiences and beliefs, yet so many games have characters that change their entire worldview as a result of a single incident. It takes months of interaction with Isara and a first-hand look at a concentration camp to even begin to budge Rosie's outlook. This means that her eventual change to respecting and loving Isara is a powerful and memorable moment. It feels believable. It feels real. This is just one of many examples of well-designed characters. I remember feeling genuinely sad when Yoko died, even though my understanding of her character was based purely on a text blurb, voice dialogues, and her potentials. The handful of characters that fail to work well universally lack any sort of accompanying background information that would prompt player interest. The two that come to mind are Prime Minister Borg and the Federation Ambassador. Borg in particular reminds me of the NPC design of your average JRPG, a one-dimensional, contrived caricature, in this case of a corrupt politician. Perhaps the game's designers recognized this when they decided to include this sequence, which seemingly comes out of nowhere.
Do we look the fool that might trust a dog with so little loyalty to his master as you? Put this man to death by firing squad. Gallia tomorrow has no place for him.
The primary protagonist, Welkin, is a somewhat stereotypical Japanese lead, with a stoicism that doesn't falter even after the death of his sister. To the designer's credit, though, Welkin's personality shows the same consistency and thoughtfulness as the other characters. His background in natural sciences is another unique inclusion that helps drive home the game's core narrative message of the folly of pursuing power. This message comes across as heavy-handed, with Jaeger even explicitly spelling it out for the player if they hadn't figured it out yet. Power doesn't work. Welkin's belief system, that power dynamics do exist in nature, but humans are capable of overcoming them through better, more peaceful means, represents the game's underlying message. Perhaps most interesting to me is that, despite the many parallels that the game draws between the Empire and Axis powers in World War II, by the end of the game, I saw more similarities with Imperial Japan. Of particular note is the Empire's purpose, obtaining Ragnite as a power source, similar to Imperial Japan's pursuit of natural resources in Manchuria and Korea. The realization by Jaeger near the end of the game that the pursuit of power is not the right path mirrors Japan's similar realization at the end of World War II. No other society in history has so quickly pivoted from warlike imperialism to a near universal belief in pacifism. The game's underlying message of will, of choosing to do something else aside from war, of choosing an alternate path from power, even though power dynamics do exist in the world, is a uniquely Japanese phenomenon. The idea that power is not something to be pursued is hardly the lesson that was drawn from World War II by most Western countries. Yet when applied to Japan, it fits perfectly. Of particular interest to me was the contrast between Silveria and Alicia. Silveria opted to use her power as a Valkyria to detonate what is clearly depicted as a nuclear-like explosion. When Alicia attempted to do the same, Welkin stopped her, explaining the folly of her plan. It's not to say that I think Silveria and Alicia are metaphors for something in the real world. Instead, I think the designer's intent is to say that participating in the nuclear arms race is a self-defeating proposition, even if one's own side has suffered because of it. Now I should mention that this is speculation on my part, and I might be reading a little bit too much into this. My point is that while I think there was a clear attempt to draw parallels between the Empire and Nazi Germany, I think the underlying narrative's message is much more focused on Japan than it is on the West. More broadly, I think the message is applicable across a number of historical events, and isn't only limited to the Second World War. The theme of power is buttressed by a plotline concerning the history and bloodline of the Valkyrie. Despite the game's title, I would argue that this is actually secondary to the events of the game. For one, it's presented as a part of Europa's history, rather than a key contributor to the current conflict. By the end of the game, the plot has tied the two together by revealing that House Randgreaves is actually composed of Darksons, but this is a weak connection that felt, at least to me, like an afterthought. The core theme of the futility of power is largely contradicted by the Valkyrie's success in rewriting history, changing the trajectory of the entire world. Alicia's off-the-cuff remark about Valkyrie not being human adds further separation from the primary plot, and the lack of any explanation as to where the Valkyrie went tells me that the designers probably didn't think that entire subplot through. None of this is to say that I didn't enjoy the Valkyrie backstory, and in fact it's what I found most compelling during the mid-game. It's just that I think there are more important parts to the narrative. Like I mentioned earlier, I think it's a disservice to categorize Valkyria based solely on its mechanics, because the narrative complements and augments the gameplay. Much of the game's excellent pacing comes from the player choosing to take a break from missions to watch cutscenes and read the lore. It's also worth mentioning that a subcomponent of the Valkyrie backstory, the discrimination against Darksons, is handled quite well. In contrast with the larger theme of power, this is never presented using an overhead map or background news articles. It's consistently told through the lens of characters, primarily Isara and Cordelia, although the voice dialogues of supporting squad members also contribute. This makes a lot of sense to me, and I'm glad that Valkyria didn't try to neatly tie things up by pointing out that the war ended all prejudice against the Darksons. In reality, prejudice and bigotry like this is most felt at an individual level. It makes sense to convey a message about prejudice through characters' individual experiences, since that's largely how it plays out in reality, at least in my experience. At its core, Valkyria Chronicles is about its characters, their hopes, their dreams, their triumphs, and their failures. As a mechanical game, it works extremely well, but this isn't enough to make it a great game. What makes it great is the way all of its gameplay systems come together to help the player develop an affinity for its characters. Even by the end of the game, losing a member of my squad felt like a real loss. The description of different characters' post-war outcomes are satisfying and impactful, not because the game tells you that they matter, not because the game has pushed your buttons to force you to care, but because as a result of playing the game, you actually do care. Rarely do I actively empathize with characters in games, preferring those titles that give me a blank slate to make my own. Valkyria is a clear exception. For me, it's one of the best games I've played this year. Thanks everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed my take on this fantastic game. I'll see you next time.